The shocking death of the last surviving outlaw. What truths were hidden in the final days of Cole Younger, the last surviving outlaw of the James Younger gang? What do we make of reports that he was seen walking about town in good health, just hours before his sudden collapse? And what contradictions in testimony and missing evidence still keep historians divided more than a century later? Later in this video, we'll uncover the theories and clues that make his death one of the West's enduring mysteries. How does an outlaw condemned to spend the rest of his life behind bars emerge decades later as a reformed celebrity, praised on lecture stages and in newspapers? This is the strange arc of Cole Younger's story after his capture at Northfield, Minnesota, in 1876. Few men in the Wild West ever lived long enough to reinvent themselves. Fewer still managed to turn a past soaked in blood into a future built on respectability. But Cole Younger did. Or at least he appeared to. Whether this transformation was sincere or carefully staged remains one of the central questions behind his legacy and his mysterious death. Let's begin with the end of the James Younger gang. On September 7, 1876, the gang rode into Northfield, Minnesota, hoping to rob the First National Bank. The plan collapsed in spectacular fashion. Townspeople fought back, leaving 2 gang members dead in the street. Cole Younger, along with his brothers Jim and Bob, was badly wounded and captured after a desperate 2-week manhunt. Jesse and Frank James escaped, but the Youngers faced trial and life sentences. Prison at Stillwater, Minnesota, seemed the final chapter. For 25 years, Cole lived behind bars, his outlaw days apparently over. But even here, something curious happened. Cole Younger began to cultivate a different reputation. Reports describe him as a model prisoner, hardworking, disciplined, even respected by guards and fellow inmates. He studied, read widely, and presented himself as a man who had reformed. Visitors noted his calm demeanor, his willingness to accept responsibility for his crimes, and his newfound embrace of religion. By 1901, public opinion had shifted. After multiple petitions and appeals from supporters, Cole and his brother Jim were granted parole. Bob had died in prison years earlier, but Cole walked free at last, a gray-haired man in his late 50s. The outlaw who once terrorized banks and stagecoaches was now presented to the world as a penitent soul, reformed by time and hardship. What happened next is where history and legend begin to intertwine. Almost immediately, Cole began capitalizing on his fame. He and Frank James, once partners in crime, now became partners in performance. They joined Wild West shows, where they appeared on stage together, reenacting sanitized versions of their outlaw days. The irony was striking. Men once hunted by posses now entertained paying audiences with tales of the very crimes that had once made them notorious. Crowds flocked to see them, curious to glimpse the real outlaws who had become part of frontier folklore. But Cole didn't stop with show business. He launched a lecture circuit, speaking to church groups, civic organizations, and schools about the dangers of crime. His speeches often mixed moral lessons with colorful anecdotes from his past. He warned young men against the temptations of lawlessness, holding himself up as a cautionary example. Newspapers praised his candor and religious convictions. To many Americans, Cole Younger had become a living testament to the possibility of redemption. Still, not everyone was convinced. Critics pointed out the contradictions in his message. How could a man profit from retelling his crimes while preaching against crime itself? Was his transformation genuine, or was it another performance designed to rehabilitate his image while keeping him in the spotlight? Some historians suggest Cole's public repentance may have been as carefully crafted as his earlier outlaw reputation. Another mask, another role. Cole also wrote an autobiography, The Story of Cole Younger, by himself, published in 1903. In it, he portrayed himself as a reluctant outlaw, a man dragged into crime by circumstance and loyalty, particularly to Jesse James. He insisted that he had always tried to act honorably, even within the gang, and distanced himself from the more brutal acts attributed to his companions. The book reinforced his new public image, a man who regretted his past, accepted responsibility, and sought forgiveness. But was this revisionist history? Many historians think so. Cole downplayed his active role in robberies and killings, placing blame on others or on the chaos of the Civil War. His autobiography smoothed over contradictions, painting a picture that matched his reformed persona. It was effective. Audiences embraced the idea of an outlaw turned philosopher. Yet the very neatness of the narrative invites skepticism. Was Cole truly transformed, or was he reshaping his story to control how posterity would remember him? Consider the cultural climate of the early 1900s. America was nostalgic for the frontier, which was vanishing rapidly. Wild West shows, dime novels, and early films celebrated outlaws and lawmen alike. Cole Younger fit perfectly into this fascination. His survival into old age allowed him to step into the role of storyteller, spinning his past into legend. And by framing himself as reformed, he could enjoy public attention without condemnation. But private accounts hint at something more complex. Some who knew Cole later in life described him as proud of his outlaw past, even boastful at times. While he preached repentance publicly, in private he may not have fully disavowed the choices he had made. If that's true, then his reinvention was less about redemption and more about survival, a way to turn infamy into a form of respectability. This duality, public saint, private outlaw, feeds directly into the questions surrounding his death. When he passed in 1916, newspapers emphasized the peaceful end of a reformed man. But the contradictions in his life make that story too simple. If his transformation was partly performance, how much of the official story of his death was shaped by the same instinct to manage his image? Before we move on, consider this. Cole Younger's post-prison career shows how thin the line can be between outlaw and celebrity, between confession and performance. He mastered the art of reinvention, but whether it was sincere redemption or just another mask is a question that lingers. The official story of his death. When an outlaw dies in his bed, newspapers rarely resist the chance to write the perfect closing line. For Cole Younger, that line came in March 1916, when headlines across Missouri announced the passing of the last surviving member of the James Younger gang. They told readers it was a peaceful end, a quiet death at home in Lee's Summit. But as with so much of Cole's life, even this final chapter contains contradictions, reports that differ, sudden details that don't fit, and rumors that suggest the official story may have been crafted to suit the legend, not the man. Let's begin with what we know for certain. On March 21, 1916, Thomas Coleman Younger died at the age of 72. Accounts generally attribute his death to heart failure. He had been living in Missouri for years after his parole, no longer roaming as an outlaw or appearing in Wild West shows, but quietly keeping to himself. For the newspapers, it was the final act in a redemption story. The once notorious outlaw who had served his time, repented, and gone to his grave in peace. But if we look closer, the narrative is less tidy. Reports of his health in the months before his death vary. Some stories describe him as frail, suffering from lingering war wounds and the toll of old age. Others suggest that, up until shortly before his death, he remained surprisingly vigorous for a man of 72. According to certain accounts, his passing came suddenly, almost without warning, as if something had happened that was not fully explained. There is also the matter of how his death was reported. In some papers, it was framed as the inevitable conclusion of a long decline. In others, it was painted as a sudden collapse, almost unexpected. Why the difference? Was it sloppy reporting, or did different witnesses describe his last days in conflicting ways? That ambiguity opened the door to speculation, especially in a culture already steeped in outlaw myths. Consider the way Jesse James's death in 1882 had been debated, some insisting he had been killed by Robert Ford, others claiming he had staged his death and lived under an alias. Billy the Kid, too, was said to have escaped Pat Garrett's bullet. Against this backdrop, Cole Younger's peaceful passing seemed too ordinary, too anticlimactic. In the absence of a dramatic gunfight or assassination, the imagination of the public filled the gap. Could his death have been sudden for other reasons? Illness concealed, stress from secrets, or something darker? Then there is the question of money and secrets. For decades, rumors swirled about hidden loot from James Younger robberies, especially the disastrous Northfield raid. Some believed Cole knew more than he admitted, and that he carried knowledge of treasure stashes or unconfessed crimes to his grave. His sudden death fueled speculation. Had he revealed anything before the end? Did he die with secrets still intact? The timing of his death also carried symbolic weight. By 1916, most of his contemporaries were gone. Jesse and Bob Younger were long dead. Jim had died in 1902, and Frank James had passed in 1915. Cole's death, coming so soon after Frank's, was reported as the closing of an era, the final curtain for the James, Younger gang. This framing was convenient for the newspapers, giving readers the sense of historical closure. But history rarely closes so neatly. We should also note how Cole's own reinvention colored the way his death was presented. For years, he had toured as a reformed man, warning against the life of crime. His autobiography portrayed him as repentant. His lectures emphasized his Christian faith. When he died, the press leaned into that image. They printed obituaries that highlighted not his outlaw days, but his transformation into a respectable citizen. The outlaw had become the moral example. His death was reported not as a scandal, but as a sermon. Crime does not pay, but redemption is possible. Yet not everyone accepted this portrayal. In some circles, Cole's death was whispered about as staged, either to cover secrets or to allow him to slip quietly away from public attention. There is no hard evidence for this theory, but its persistence reveals something important. Many people found it easier to believe in conspiracy than in quiet closure. The very ordinariness of Cole's death seemed unbelievable for a man whose life had been anything but ordinary. Have you noticed how history often polishes its endings? The official story of Cole Younger's death reads like the tidy conclusion of a dime novel, an outlaw who paid for his crimes, reformed, and died in peace. But beneath that narrative lie inconsistencies, differing reports of his health, vague descriptions of his final moments, and lingering suspicions about what he may have taken to the grave. Before we move on, let's close this chapter. On March 21st, 1916, Cole Younger was pronounced dead in Lee's Summit. To the newspapers, it was the death of a penitent man who had turned his back on crime. To his community, it was the passing of a neighbor who had lived quietly in his final years. But to those who knew the legends, it was yet another mystery. A man who had defied bullets, prisons, and scandal somehow ended with a story too simple to be true. In the next part, we'll examine those rumors of concealment, the theories that Cole's death may have been staged, or that the official story was shaped to protect reputations and bury secrets. Did the last surviving Younger truly die as reported, or did the legend once again prove larger than the facts? Rumors of concealment. When the last surviving member of the James, Younger gang died in 1916, the press told America the story it wanted, an old outlaw redeemed, closing his eyes in peace. But almost immediately, another story began to circulate, one whispered in saloons, printed in smaller papers, and repeated by those who distrusted tidy endings. Did Cole Younger really die as reported, or was the official story a cover, concealing secrets too dangerous for the public? To understand why these rumors took hold, we need to look at the contradictions surrounding his final days. As mentioned earlier, some reports describe Cole's health as failing steadily in the months leading up to his death. Others, however, claim he remained reasonably strong and even active until the very end. One local account describes him being seen walking through town shortly before his sudden collapse. If true, that discrepancy raises a question. Was his death truly the result of long-term decline, or something abrupt that the papers glossed over? Then there is the matter of timing. Cole Younger died less than a year after Frank James, who passed away in 1915. With both men gone, newspapers proclaimed the end of the outlaw era. Some historians argue this framing was too convenient. Was Cole's death used as a narrative device, closing the book on frontier outlawry at a moment when America, on the brink of World War I, was eager to believe the Wild West was safely in the past? If so, how much of the story of his death was shaped to match that desire? But perhaps the most persistent rumors revolve around the idea of hidden treasure. The James, Younger gang robbed trains, banks, and stagecoaches for years, amassing fortunes that were never fully recovered. Locals whispered that Cole carried the knowledge of stashed loot, gold, or cash hidden in Missouri backcountry. His sudden death fueled speculation that he may have revealed, or refused to reveal, its location in his last hours. Some even suggested that the official story of his passing concealed a more dramatic event, perhaps an argument over money, or a revelation hushed up to protect others. And then comes the possibility of a staged death. If Jesse James could inspire decades of theories that he had not really died in 1882, it is no surprise that some believe Cole Younger followed the same path. The theory usually goes like this. Cole, tired of attention, staged his death and slipped quietly away to live under another name. Supporters of this idea point to the vague medical reports, the conflicting descriptions of his health, and the speed with which his body was buried. While no hard evidence supports this claim, the very ordinariness of his reported death makes it suspect in the eyes of those who expect drama from outlaws. Have you noticed how myths thrive in the gaps? Cole Younger's death provided just enough space, contradictory accounts, missing details, unanswered questions, for speculation to flourish. And once seeded, those rumors grew, nourished by America's fascination with outlaw legends. There's also the issue of Cole's image management. For years, he had cultivated the role of the reformed outlaw, lecturer, author, man of faith. By 1916, that persona was firmly established. Could the peaceful death narrative have been part of that same image-making? Perhaps his friends, family, or sympathetic reporters smoothed over details that didn't fit the redemption arc. A sudden collapse, a violent struggle, or even suspicious circumstances would have disrupted the story. By keeping it simple, an old man dying quietly, the legend remained intact. Another angle worth considering is the political climate of Missouri at the time. The Younger family was deeply tied to Confederate memory and Southern sympathies. Cole himself had been a Confederate guerrilla before becoming an outlaw. In death, portraying him as redeemed may have also served a political purpose, allowing Missouri to bury not just a man, but the uncomfortable connections between guerrilla violence, outlawry, and local politics. In that sense, Cole's peaceful death was as much about the state's image as his own. What about the testimonies of those who were closest to him? Strangely, there is little detail from family or friends about his final moments. Unlike the dramatic deathbed scenes often recorded for public figures, Cole's end is curiously vague. Did no one think to record his last words? Did no family member describe his final hours? That silence stands out, especially for a man who had lived so publicly. Before we move on, let's step back. Rumors of concealment, staged death, hidden treasure, sanitized accounts may never be proven. But their persistence tells us something important. The public was unwilling to accept a simple ending for a man whose life had been so complex. In the American imagination, outlaws die in gunfights, ambushes, or betrayals, not in bed with a prayer on their lips. When reality offered ordinariness, rumor supplied mystery. In the next part, we'll look at the conflicting accounts of Cole Younger's death in more detail, examining the differences in newspaper reports, eyewitness recollections, and how those contradictions fueled the legend that still surrounds him today. Conflicting accounts. When history is written, it is rarely consistent. Nowhere is this clearer than in the accounts of Cole Younger's death. Depending on which newspaper you picked up in March 1916, you might have read of a slow, dignified decline, or of a sudden and almost inexplicable collapse. Some reports emphasized the peace of his passing, while others hinted at something abrupt, even unsettling. These contradictions shaped not just how people understood his death, but also how his legend lived on. Let's start with the local accounts in Missouri. In Lee's Summit, where Cole died, papers reported that he had been in poor health for years. They cited lingering injuries from his outlaw days, war wounds from his time as a Confederate guerrilla, and ailments accumulated during his 25 years in Stillwater Prison. In this version, his heart simply gave out. The story painted a picture of inevitability, the once feared outlaw brought low by time itself, finally resting after a long, hard life. But other reports circulated a different version. Some papers, particularly those outside Missouri, described his death as sudden. They suggested he had been seen walking about town not long before his final collapse, that neighbors still considered him active for his age. To those readers, Cole's death was not the predictable outcome of decline, but something abrupt and unexplained. Why the difference? Was it careless reporting, or were witnesses themselves describing two different realities? Then there were the obituaries themselves. Some leaned heavily into the redemption narrative, emphasizing his religious conversion, his years of preaching against crime, his autobiographical claims of regret. These papers framed his death as the moral conclusion of a life redeemed. Others, however, couldn't resist reminding readers of his outlaw past, placing his crimes in the foreground and treating his repentance with skepticism. In their framing, Cole's death was not the peaceful end of a redeemed man, but the belated justice of time finally catching up with a criminal. The lack of detailed testimony from those closest to Cole only deepens the contradictions. Unlike Jesse James, whose death produced detailed witness accounts and still spawned endless conspiracy theories, Cole's passing left little in the way of personal recollection. Few reports record the voices of family members or close friends. His death is described more as an event reported at a distance, rather than a scene witnessed intimately. Why so little detail? Was it simply overlooked, or were awkward circumstances smoothed over in print? Even the cause of death is inconsistently described. Some papers called it heart failure, others referred vaguely to natural causes, and a few mentioned complications from old wounds. But none offered a medical report or physician's statement with specifics. The absence of detail may have been typical for the time, but for a figure like Cole Younger, it left fertile ground for rumor. If the official story had included a clear, consistent medical explanation, the whispers might have died quickly. Instead, the gaps encouraged speculation. Have you noticed how contradictions often become more important than the facts themselves? In Cole's case, each version of his death told a different story. The slow decline narrative supported the image of redemption, an old man who had paid his debt, changed his ways, and died in peace. The sudden collapse narrative fit the outlaw myth better, a man whose life had been filled with surprises leaving the world in one final, unexpected twist. Both versions circulated side by side, leaving the public to choose which Cole Younger they wanted to believe in. Historians today face the same problem. Without consistent records, they are left comparing clippings, obituaries, and secondhand accounts. Some lean toward the peaceful end as the most plausible. After all, Cole was in his 70s, with injuries and prison years behind him. Others highlight the inconsistencies, arguing that the very contradictions suggest something was being concealed, or at least managed. And then there is the cultural context. By 1916, Americans were accustomed to outlaw deaths being contested. Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, all had deaths surrounded by conspiracy theories and survival legends. Against that backdrop, even small contradictions in Cole's story took on larger meaning. People were primed to doubt, to wonder, to imagine. A simple, peaceful death didn't fit the script they expected from a man who had once defied the law and lived through so much. Before we move on, let's step back. What do these conflicting accounts really tell us? Not necessarily that Cole's death was suspicious, but that it was interpreted through competing lenses. Some wanted him remembered as reformed. Others wanted him remembered as outlaw. His actual passing may have been simple, but the way it was written turned it into another chapter in the battle over his legacy. In the next part, we'll explore the legacy of myth. Why even when outlaws like Cole Younger die quietly, their endings never stay quiet for long. Legends demand drama, and when it isn't there, people create it. Legacy of myth. Why is it so hard to believe that an outlaw could simply die in peace? For Jesse James, Billy the Kid, and Butch Cassidy, theories of escape, survival, and fake deaths emerged almost instantly. Cole Younger is different. His death was reported plainly, an old man passing away in his Missouri hometown. Yet even in this apparent ordinariness, myth crept in. People whispered about hidden treasure, staged deaths, and secrets buried with him. The contradiction is telling. In the American imagination, the outlaw is larger than life, and legends rarely allow such men to fade away quietly. Let's start with the obvious. Cole Younger had already reinvented himself. For years after leaving Stillwater Prison, he presented himself as a man transformed. His lectures, autobiography, and Wild West shows all promoted the image of the reformed outlaw. So when he died in 1916, it was easy for newspapers to craft a narrative of redemption fulfilled. The problem? That version didn't satisfy the public's appetite for drama. Outlaws were supposed to go down in gunfights, ambushes, or betrayal. A death in bed, of heart failure, seemed anticlimactic. And so, myth stepped in to fill the gap. Some whispered that Cole had faked his death, following in the footsteps of Jesse James' conspiracy theories. Others claimed he had died suddenly under suspicious circumstances, and that the peaceful passing story was a cover. A few insisted that his death was linked to outlaw loot, gold or cash from James, younger robberies that had never been recovered. Did Cole take the secret to his grave, or had he revealed it to someone in his final hours? These stories spread because Cole's life had already blurred the line between fact and fiction. His autobiography cast him as a reluctant outlaw, a man misled by Jesse James. His lectures painted him as a repentant sinner turned moral guide. Yet eyewitness accounts and historical evidence contradicted parts of those claims. If he had shaped his own legend in life, why wouldn't people believe the same had happened in death? It's worth noting that Cole's myth didn't exist in isolation. Across America, outlaw legends thrived on ambiguity. Jesse James was said to have lived under the name J. Frank Dalton in Texas. Billy the Kid was claimed to be Brushy Bill Roberts, living quietly in New Mexico. Butch Cassidy was rumored to have returned from Bolivia, appearing in Utah and Wyoming years after his supposed death. Against this backdrop, Cole Younger's quiet passing looked suspiciously tidy. Outlaws, after all, weren't supposed to go quietly. Have you ever noticed how myths about outlaw deaths often serve cultural needs? In times of change, they gave Americans a link to a wilder, freer past. By 1916, the frontier was gone, the Wild West closing in memory. The idea that Cole Younger simply passed away threatened to make that past feel too distant, too final. Believing in hidden treasure or a staged death kept the legend alive, ensuring the outlaw era remained within reach. The myth also served a personal function for those who admired or despised Cole. To admirers, rumors of hidden riches or staged death made him larger than life, a man who defied even the grave. To critics, contradictions in his story confirmed their suspicion that he had always manipulated his image, even in death. Either way, the myth kept him in the public eye long after his burial. And let's not forget the role of popular culture. Newspapers, dime novels, and eventually movies all contributed to the way outlaws were remembered. Writers wanted drama, not closure. The James, Younger gang had already become folklore by the early 20th century. Cole's death was folded into that tradition. If the facts didn't provide spectacle, the legend would. Historians today point out that Cole's death almost certainly was natural. He was 72, with injuries from his guerrilla and outlaw days, and decades in prison behind him. Heart failure fits the medical reality. But the persistence of myths about his end reveals a deeper truth. Once a man becomes a legend, the facts of his death matter less than the stories people tell about it. Before we close, think about this. Cole Younger's peaceful death didn't erase his outlaw past. It added a final contradiction to it. Was he a redeemed sinner, as the papers claimed? Or was he still the outlaw at heart, hiding secrets until the very end? The mystery lies not in the cause of death, but in how people interpreted it. His end became another piece of the legend, a story that continues to invite speculation. In the next and final part, we'll step into the work of modern historians. They've combed through obituaries, coroners' records, and family recollections, comparing testimony against myth. What emerges is not just a verdict on Cole Younger's death, but a broader lesson: why America refuses to let its outlaws truly die. Modern reassessment. More than a century has passed since Cole Younger's death in 1916, yet historians still debate how to interpret his final chapter. On paper, the story seems straightforward. A 72-year-old man, weakened by wounds, prison, and age, dies of heart failure in his Missouri hometown. But once we compare obituaries, testimonies, and public memory, the contradictions reappear. And modern scholarship has shown that the way Cole Younger died tells us as much about how legends are built as it does about the man himself. Let's begin with the evidence. No coroner's inquest was held for Cole, and no detailed medical report survives. That in itself is not unusual for the time, but it leaves historians working with only newspaper clippings, family recollections, and public accounts. Some papers described a slow decline, others suggested a sudden collapse. Without a physician's report to anchor the record, the ambiguity became fertile ground for speculation. Historians emphasize this absence of hard evidence. Unlike Jesse James, whose death in 1882 produced affidavits, photographs, and even an exhumed body tested with DNA in 1995, Cole Younger left behind only words. That silence is why his peaceful passing feels less like a fact and more like a narrative, crafted by those who wrote it down. Next comes the issue of reputation. Cole Younger spent his last 15 years shaping his image as a reformed outlaw. His autobiography, his lecture tours, and his partnership with Frank James in Wild West shows all contributed to the public's perception of him as a man redeemed by hardship. When he died, newspapers leaned heavily on that narrative. To many editors, his passing wasn't simply news. It was the conclusion of a morality play. Crime does not pay, but repentance and reform bring peace. But historians note the gap between public image and private recollections. Letters and interviews suggest Cole remained proud of his outlaw past, sometimes dismissive of the repentance he preached on stage. Did the Real Cole die quietly of natural causes, or was the story of his peaceful death another layer of image management, built by his family, friends, and the press? Without direct testimony from his closest circle, the truth is difficult to pin down. Another layer of modern reassessment focuses on the cultural context. By 1916, the outlaw era was already mythologized. The frontier was closed, the old battles of Reconstruction fading, and America was entering a new age of modernity and global war. Newspapers were eager to frame Cole's death as the symbolic end of the Wild West. Just as Jesse James's death had once been used to declare the end of outlaw terror, Cole's passing was used to proclaim closure. Historians point out how convenient this was, how perfectly his death fit the narrative needs of the time. That neatness itself invites skepticism. And yet, some modern writers warn against pushing too far into conspiracy. There is no evidence that Cole's death was staged or that foul play was involved. Theories about hidden treasure, sudden collapse, or cover-ups are compelling, but largely speculative. The likeliest explanation remains the simplest. Cole Younger, aged and weakened, died naturally. But the fact that this simple answer is unsatisfying reveals something about the way legends work. Have you noticed how outlaw stories rarely end quietly? Jesse James, Billy the Kid, Butch Cassidy, all remain surrounded by theories of survival. Cole Younger's death, by contrast, is doubted not because there is evidence of trickery, but because it lacks drama. The ordinariness itself is what keeps people wondering. In a way, the suspicion is the legacy. Modern historians like Marley Brandt and Frank Triplett have compared dozens of obituaries and local accounts, noting how inconsistent they are. Some called Cole's death a long-expected end. Others wrote of a sudden collapse, with neighbors expressing surprise. This inconsistency has become the core of modern reassessment. Not proof of conspiracy, but proof of how easily narrative replaces fact. Cole Younger's death tells us less about his final hours and more about how stories are told, retold, and reshaped to suit public appetite. And that brings us to the larger point. Cole Younger's life spanned the Civil War, the outlaw era, decades in prison, and early 20th century America. His death closed a remarkable life, but it also opened the door to questions about how history remembers outlaws. Do we believe the official version because it's likely true, or do we resist it because legends never seem to die quietly? In the absence of evidence, the imagination steps in. Before we close, let's return to the question we started with. Did Cole Younger really die peacefully in Lee's Summit in 1916? Almost certainly yes. But does that answer satisfy? For many, it doesn't. That dissatisfaction is why rumors persist. Rumors of hidden loot, sudden collapse, or staged death. They aren't supported by documents, but they thrive because people expect outlaws to leave the world the way they lived in it, dramatically, defiantly, and larger than life. In the end, Cole Younger's death remains both ordinary and extraordinary. Ordinary, because he likely died of natural causes at an old age. Extraordinary, because even in that simplicity, it became part of a larger legend. Modern reassessment reminds us that history is not just about what happened. It's about what people believed happened and why they chose to believe it. And so, more than 100 years later, the last surviving Younger still commands attention, not because of how he lived, but because of how he died, or how people wanted to believe he died.